Alright, enough of my lesbian agenda. With the end of the year coming soon, I want to talk about the best books that I read in the year of 2021. Usually people come onto this video because they want to see book recommendations, but if you're interested in seeing more books that are great to read, might I suggest you to check out my sponsor of the video, Book of the Month? I know, what a surprise. Surely you haven't heard about them from everyone else and their mother by now. They are a super popular and fast-growing online book service for readers. Their mission is to promote new and emerging authors and help readers discover new books that they love. So every month they curate hundreds of book titles and put together a list of 5 books for readers to choose from. And these are new and early release titles too. They are risk-free, so you can skip any month, anytime, and you'll not be charged. I'm doing a giveaway for the 5 books that they selected for December, which include Olga Dies Dreaming, a debut about 2 siblings vying for the American dream until Hurricane Maria drags their estranged mother back into their lives. A History of Wild Places, a magical realism tale about the search for a missing woman last seen going into an isolated forest town. A Flicker in the Dark, a thriller debut about a woman dealing with a serial killer with an eerily familiar pattern from her past. Somebody's Daughter, a coming-of-age memoir about the complications of family and the resilience of love. The Holiday Swap, a romance about twins who decide to swap places for holiday hijinks. They also include add-ons like this collection of essays by John Green. My choice for the month is Somebody's Daughter, so I'm currently reading that right now. I actually saw the author give a talk about 2 years ago, and I really loved her personality, so I can't wait to dive into her memoir. Giveaway details will be in my description below, but if you want the books guaranteed, they're running a special deal where new members can get their first book for only $5 if they use the coupon code JOLLY. So I have looked back on all the books that I read this year so far. I have found 5 books that I rated 5 stars, so I will be highlighting it in this video. I will also share quotes from these books so that you can have an idea of what the writing is like. These aren't necessarily the best books ever, nor are they even books that were released this year. They just happen to be books that I read in the year 2021, and I appreciated them enough to rate it 5 stars. I'm gonna list them in order of the time that I read them, not by any quality. And I'll also mention 3 runner-ups towards the end of books that I still thought were really good, even though I didn't rate it 5 stars. The first book that I had the most fun time reading throughout the whole year was actually the first book that I ever read in the year. That is The Inheritance Games. I'm glad that we're starting off with this book first so that you can already tell that this list is really not based on quality, it's just based on whatever the hell I feel like rating. Was this book amazing and unique and original? No, but did I have a super fun time reading it? Absolutely. It's basically about a poor girl who finds out that she has inherited billions of dollars from this dude that passed away. She gets his entire fortune. She has no idea why because she's never even met this guy. This is pretty much my dream, to inherit a bunch of money from a dead billionaire, because fuck the rich, but I also want your money. But I also don't want to deal with you either. But then you're dead, so I don't have to do shit. I too want to get money for doing absolutely nothing. To receive her inheritance, she has to move into his big sprawling estate, which, oh my god, is such a pain. I hate it when I had to move into this fancy mansion filled with housekeepers. This billionaire is known to always be super into games and riddles, so he's decorated the place to be like that. There's all these codes and puzzles that she has to decipher in every room that she goes to. But for me, I would just be chilling in my bedroom, so you're not gonna catch me trying to use my brain. If I inherit billions of dollars, I will never think again. Another unique quality is that she also has to share the estate with 4 of his grandsons, who of course are all handsome. That's right, bitches, we have a reverse harem here. If it sounds like this is straight out of an anime, it basically is. I rated this 5 stars solely because I had such a fun time reading this with my friend. And that's what reading books is for, right? To enjoy them. Sometimes we forget that on this channel. I enjoyed this for the same reason that I enjoyed Knives Out, because there is something so satisfying about seeing a poor, humble girl get a bunch of money while the rich don't get shit. This is wish fulfillment for poor girls. But also the mystery was surprisingly compelling. My friend and I had so much fun guessing what the answers could be and making theories as we read along. There were so many questions that were constantly brought up, and every time there was an answer to one of the questions, it just opened up even more questions. So my friend and I are reading this and we're like, this makes no damn sense, but it compels me though. And I really liked all the characters, even the boys. guys. I thought all of them had strong personalities, unique quirks. The dialogue that they had with each other was really fun. There is instant attraction, which I don't really buy, but because the dynamics were so much fun to read about and the love triangle was kind of juicy, I was able to look over that. That being said, I read the sequel that got published later this year and I rated that 2 stars. In fact, when I go through my list of books that I read this year for my worst books of 2021, that book might end up being on the worst books list as well, which I guess really just shows the range that the author has. If she can both pleasantly surprise me and disappoint me all in 1 year, that is kind of an impressive job. Here are some quotes that I enjoyed. One of the grandsons tells the main character, "We aren't normal. This place isn't normal. And you're not a player, kid. You're the glass ballerina or the knife." They are talking about how when they grew up, they always had to solve their grandfather's riddles. Part of the game that their grandfather used to play was giving them these props and they had to figure out the meaning of each prop, like the glass ballerina or the knife. They were players in this game and one of the guys is telling the main girl that she's not a player. She's basically just another prop. I just thought that dynamic was super interesting because she is a very smart character, at least in the first book, and she doesn't want to be another prop. She wants to be a participant in the games and figure it out for herself. But I just like the metaphor, even though it is cheesy, but whatever, we're gonna embrace the cheese here. "He left you the fortune, Avery, and all he left us is you." Interesting. Why did he do that? Why did he give the fortune to her, but not to the rest of them? It's almost like he gave her to the guys, and that's what they're trying to figure out. It's just a good time overall. The next book that I rated 5 stars is In the Dream House. This is a very unique memoir because it tells the story of the author's abusive relationship with another woman, but it frames the writing in more of like a horror story. So it feels like there's more of a narrative with some classic horror tropes rather than just straightforwardly telling you what happened. The biggest thing that I appreciated from this book was the lyrical writing. It's so lovely and haunting at the same time. She also does a good job of tackling a pretty difficult subject to talk about because not only is she talking about an abusive relationship, but there's also the added layer of the fact that it was a same-sex relationship and something like that is not often discussed about. There's that added layer of societal expectations for what a queer relationship should be like or look like. Obviously, queer relationships are not perfect, but she points out the pressure of how they often feel like they have to be perfect because you fought for so long to be accepted within mainstream society, to even have marriages legalized so that you could be with the person you love. And so to have a relationship fail feels almost humiliating that way. I think a lot of the topics and emotions will resonate with people who have had experience dealing with toxic relationships before. To give you an idea of the writing, here are some of my favorite quotes. "We deserve to have our wrongdoing represented as much as our heroism, because when we refuse wrongdoing as a possibility for a group of people, we refuse their humanity." It's true. I think a lot of times when minority groups, whether it's queer groups or a racial group, have to share their experience or prove themselves, they are expected to have that added layer of perfection. But no one can really be perfect, and relationships are especially not perfect. "Love cannot be won or lost. A relationship doesn't have a scoring system. We are partners paired against the world. We cannot succeed if we are at odds with each other. Abusers do not need to be, and rarely are, cackling maniacs. They just need to want something and not care how they get it." Much to think about indeed. So I'll leave you off with that. Moving on to the next book that I enjoyed. It is White Tears, Brown Scars. This is a nonfiction book that talks about how white supremacy often uses the idea of white feminism or white female victimhood as a weapon against women of color, especially when it comes to Black and Indigenous women. The book does a great job at taking a comprehensive look at the historical components all the way back to the slave era to even today in the modern workplace. I usually don't read anti-racism books because I often feel like they can get quite redundant. Like, why would I need to read about a book when I can just go out and experience it myself? I can just go ahead and get hate crimes. I don't need to read about it in a book. But I really liked this book because even though I knew that white feminism is a thing and that I have been personally affected by white feminism before, there were so many good points that were articulated well, better than what I could have explained on my own, and even new points that I hadn't even considered before. I don't have this specific quote with me, but one thing she pointed out that blew my mind was the fact that when white women talk about rape, if the rapist is another white man, the white woman will often not be listened to. Whereas if the rapist were a man of color, that is when the priority shifts to demonize demonizing the man of color. This is not to blame the victim at all. This is more so to point out that the way that society views these horrible crimes, especially when those crimes involve white women victims, is very different depending on who the assaulter is, which means that the victimhood of white women had always been only effective when it comes to people of color, not towards men in general. I hope that I'm explaining this fairly, but if I find the specific picture that I took with that quote, I will go ahead and share it on the screen here. Some other quotes that I enjoyed include, women of color have to not only battle white patriarchy and that of their own culture, but must also contend with colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, and other forms of racism. Given white women have never had to deal with racial and colonial oppression, it is not surprising, though it is certainly regrettable, that so many of them still regard feminism as a movement purely concerned with gender, leaving racialized women to keep trying to draw their attention to the ways in which various oppressions affect our lives. Until white women reckon with this, mainstream Western feminism cannot be anything more than another iteration of white supremacy. This is very true, and I would also argue that this applies to white queers. This is something that I wish the book tapped more into, because I do feel like white queers often use their identity in being part of the LGBT community and twist it as a way to think that they are on the same level as a person of color, when that is totally different. You can still tell that someone is Asian or black or whatever on the street and immediately get hate crimes for it. You can't tell that with a white queer person. And also, some of us are people of color and queer, so we get the double whammy right there. Trying to reason with whiteness is akin to reasoning with a clinical narcissist who refuses to go to therapy. Frustratingly impossible, because the untreated narcissist simply does not have the requisite tools to see themselves as anything other than good. Which is true. That's why it's hard to convince some of y'all. Every white woman should read this book. I think it would be very informative. The next book that I really enjoyed over the summer was One Last Stop. This is a romance book about a cynical 23-year-old who moves to New York City. She's very much set on being a loner, and she doesn't believe in things like love or magic. There's no way that movies set in New York City are actually real. But of course, since this is a book, it works out for her because she gets to move in with all these quirky gay roommates. They have a found family together, and she meets this mysterious woman on the subway who becomes her crush because she is super hot, and she gives a scarf to her the first time that they meet because the main girl spilled some coffee on her. The other girl gave her a scarf. That's actually a big deal because no one in New York City would ever be nice to you like that. The love interest is this hot Asian chick that has a leather jacket and is very into old school punk rock, and she seems super mysterious, and the main girl wants to know more. But what she comes to find out is that the reason why she always meets that same girl every time she goes on that specific line is because that girl has been displaced from the 1970s. She's been stuck in the subway ever since then, and she doesn't remember how or why she even ended up there, or even how to get out of the subway. Can you imagine being stuck in the New York subway? That's fucking hell right there. But the main girl volunteers to help her out to figure out the clues of her past and try to help this hot Asian chick get the hell out of there. But oh no, what happens if they fall in love? This was the kind of book that I felt pretty content with giving it 4 stars until I got to the last 1/3 of the book. This was just so cute and whimsical, and you can tell that there was so much passion that the author put into the writing that I'm gonna go ahead and give it 5 stars. Am I biased because both of the protagonists are women? Maybe so. But damn it, there's just something really special about having this sapphic, fated, epic, once-in-a-lifetime romance where they never should have met, but they did. The emotions were written so tenderly, and it got me in my feels, and it's very much the kind of emotions that I want to have in my own sapphic novel that I'm writing. So for me to experience this envy for how the author was able to portray those emotions, I felt like was enough to warrant 5 stars. I was pleasantly surprised by the writing because I felt like it mirrored the feeling that the author wanted to evoke, which was magical and spontaneous and fun and whimsical. And I think that's really hard to do, especially when you set it in New York City and focus on a gay group of friends that are a found family. It's very easy to make it too cringy or cheesy and lean into the typical white liberal queer hipster bullshit. And maybe in a way it kind of does, but I still felt like the writing was better than some of the similar stories I've read like that, and I thought that it was executed well. I feel like I would have loved the book even more if I had read it after I experienced living in New York earlier this year, because I ended up loving the city and going out out with my friends, and of course they were all gay as well. The city just makes you gay. So if you love cute sapphic stories, and if you love New York City and the whimsy and magic in it, even if it is kind of crusty, but there is still like a certain charm to the crustiness, then this book might be worth checking out. And here are some of my favorite quotes. Maybe I don't know what fills it in yet, but I can look at the space around where I sit in the world, what creates that shape, and I can care about what it's made of, if it's good, if it hurts anyone, it makes people happy, if it makes me happy, and that can be enough for now. I feel like this is the kind of rambly writing that can be a little bit gooey and cheesy, but I felt like it worked for this kind of story. When you spend your whole life alone, it's incredibly appealing to move somewhere big enough to get lost in, where being alone looks like a choice. See, that's the kind of self-reflective millennial bullshit that you should be expecting from this book. But again, I feel like it worked. But you know that feeling when you wake up in the morning and you have somebody to think about, somewhere for hope to go? It's good. Even when it's bad, it's good. I, too, love that feeling. Again, New York truly does make you gay. Alright, enough of my lesbian agenda. Now let's move on to the final book, which we are reverting back to a hetero couple because I need to continue to be straight passing. That is the book that I recently talked about in my last wrap up, which is People We Meet on Vacation. This is the ultimate friends to lovers romance because it spans the course of 12 years, ever since the main girl and the main guy met in college and they went on a road trip together. They have been best friends ever since, and every single summer, no matter how far away they live from each other, with the main girl being a travel blogger in New York City and the main guy being an English teacher in their hometown, they still make the time every summer to go on a trip together. They have this amazing bond that can never be broken, except it kind of does, because when you start off in the book, 2 years ago, something happened that made them not talk to each other anymore. And the main girl realizes that even though she has made it as an influencer and gets to travel and get paid to do so, she realizes she's in a rut. The last time she was happy was when she spent time with him 2 years ago. So that forces her to try to get back in touch with him again and attempt to do one more vacation to try to salvage their friendship. I enjoyed how tenderly the feelings were written for each other. You can really tell how much devotion and care and admiration and adoration that they have for each other. The dialogue is so well done. They did banter so well. It feels very natural. You really get a sense of each character's personality, and you understand why they care for each other even though they seem to be complete opposites. Like, they still work well together. But you also understand why they haven't been together romantically, because their lifestyles are so different, and that's kind of scary because that means that one of them would have to sacrifice or compromise for each other. Maybe that's not really fair to do. Why should you have to give up something just so that you can be in a relationship with someone who is very different from you? I think that's a very valid reason. Let me read to you a bunch of cheesy quotes so that you know what kind of cheese fest you're getting into. I still have a lot to figure out, but the one thing I know is wherever you are, that's where I belong. I'll never belong anywhere like I belong with you. That is the kind of love that you can only hope to experience in real life. That's the kind of shit that you read and you're like, oh my god, does something like this truly exist in real life? I don't know if it does. But yet these emotions feel so real. It's not your job to make me happy, okay? You can't make anyone happy. I'm happy just because you exist. And that's as much of my happiness as you have control over. I love that whole sentimentality because it's so fucking true. Like, another person should not be in charge of your happiness, but if you love them so much, you are just happy that they exist in the first place. There's a quote where the main guy says, I don't think I knew I was lonely until I met you. Bruh. Can you imagine if a man said that to you? A man who existed in real life? That is almost so preposterous, but like, I wish they were capable of such depth. Anyway, that was some good shit. Those were the top 5 books that I read this year. But now I want to talk about my runner-ups. These are books that I didn't rate 5 stars, but I still feel like they're good enough to be worth mentioning in this video, especially since I don't get to talk about them as much. The first one I'm going to talk about is a more popular one, and that is A Tale for the Time Being. This follows a novelist who's on a remote island, and she finds a letter that gets washed up ashore in a Hello Kitty lunchbox. The letter is written by a 16-year-old girl living in Tokyo from from who knows how long ago. She's been dealing with a lot of depression, including a father who has made several suicide attempts before. She herself even plans to end her life. But before she does that, she decides she wants to document her great-grandmother's life from when she was living as a Buddhist nun. This was a book that had such great lyrical writing. It was very whimsical and poignant and depressing all at the same time. And what I was really impressed by was the voice of the 16-year-old girl. It truly felt like this was a teenage girl that was talking, but not in a way that felt juvenile. I mean, you still got that juvenile tone from her, but you could also tell that she was really self-reflective and smart and had such a strong personality. And it was so interesting to see the way that she interpreted the world around her. And a quote that I would like to share goes, "Sometimes when she told stories about the past, her eyes would get teary from all the memories she had, but they weren't tears. She wasn't crying. They were just the memories leaking out." The next two books I want to mention are books that are more underrated just because I haven't seen anybody really talk about these books. So the first one is Craft in the Real World. This is a resource book for fiction writers to challenge the ways that they approach writing fiction and workshopping. Because a lot of times the rules for what makes a good writing or a good story often falls within the constraints of a westernized ideal, but that's just one interpretation of what makes a good story. Oftentimes those other interpretations is what really lets marginalized writers be able to blossom when we realize that we all have different cultural expectations and biases. Not all feedback that you get is necessarily correct, and I feel like reading this book might validate those things for you. The second half of the book has a bunch of exercises that will force writers to challenge the way that they think about their stories. If you are just interested in like the craft of writing itself, this is a book that might be worth picking up. And a quote to give you an idea of the writing goes, "For a marginalized writer writing to a normative audience, the writer has to be wary of normative craft. Much of what we learn about craft, about the expectations we are supposed to consider, implies a straight, white, cis, able, etc. audience. It is easy to forget who we are writing for if we do not keep it a conscious consideration, and the default is not universal, but privileged." Much to think about indeed. So while you mull over that, I'll go over the last book I want to mention, which is Chinatown Pretty. There are no quotes for this one because it is a photography book that shows the portraits and stories of the seniors in Chinatown from cities like Los Angeles, New York City, Vancouver, Oakland, and Chicago. I also loved reading the stories about these seniors as well and where they came from and how long they've been living there. What's interesting is that when we analyze the fashion of what these seniors are wearing, they often say that they kind of just threw this together and they're not trying to like curate a lookbook or whatever. But you could argue that a lot of the shit that they wear could easily be seen in a streetwear lookbook if it were worn by a younger person. If you are someone who is super into fashion, or if you are someone who frequents the Chinatowns in your city, then you might find this book really interesting. I am gonna wrap up my best books of 2021. Go ahead and unsubscribe, and goodbye.